got questions, he always has an answer. It's Sean Hannity, this afternoon at 2, right before Joe Walsh at 5 on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Iran is still listed as a state sponsor of terror, according to the U.S. State Department.
It is.
Yeah. I raised the issue because not only will the president perhaps decide this week on whether or not to pull the U.S. out of that Iranian nuclear deal, the deal that, as the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. described, Ron Demmer, provides a path, not a hurdle, to a nuclear Iran, which is a problem in the region, but also because you have a former Secretary of State, John Kerry, apparently engaged in shadow negotiations with Iranian officials trying to preserve the deal that he and the Obama administration cobbled together. And this has been underreported. I'm reading it from the Washington Examiner, which is a conservative news outlet. I haven't seen a lot of reporting of this. I haven't seen a lot of attendant hysteria about collusion with enemies of America about this. I haven't seen pundits on CNN and MSNBC lighting their hair on fire over this possible violation of the Logan Act. This is something that they were happy to raise as it pertained to Michael Flynn when he was National Security Advisor over his communications with foreign officials. So it's just interesting, the different standards. Are we not to understand Iran being an enemy of the state anymore? Are we to allow former secretaries of state to willy-nilly operate as shadow diplomats? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Sharyl Attkisson, of course, famed investigative journalist. Her latest book, The Smear, How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. How about what you don't see, like coverage of this John Kerry gambit? Sharyl, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks. I have often argued that the self-censorship or the news that we choose not to cover is often as important, if not more important than the news we choose to cover.
Yeah, and so what about this lack of coverage? This seems to be a fairly high-profile national security issue and a seminal alleged accomplishment of the Obama administration that has the potential to be undone by President Trump, and a former Secretary of State running around engaged in a lobbying campaign in consultation with the Iranians and against potentially the interests of certainly this president and his administration. That seems like it would demand some questions be asked.
I think fair minds would and do ask questions about that sort of thing, but it goes back to when the deal was made, when the money was shipped in the dead of night without congressional approval under the Obama administration to Iran, as you rightly said, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism. And this is done unilaterally. I mean, to this day, we don't really know how much money we sent to them because there was no way for anybody to oversee it. It was just reported after the fact. And I think that is probably one of the most questionable yet least questioned events of the past 10 years or so when it comes to international politics or diplomacy or whatever you'd want to call it. They got very little critical scrutiny, really, in my mind. Again, Obama officials, intel officials, when asked, typically placed Iran above Russia in terms of national security threat. And yet this was the country that we made probably the largest deal with in terms of, money and influence under the Obama administration.
Well, what's his motive? I mean, no one knows if he's getting any kickbacks or anything, but isn't his son-in-law Iranian?
I have no idea. Sorry, I don't know. I haven't studied this issue.
Yeah, there's a good chapter about John Kerry's relations and their business dealings with Iran in Peter Schweizer's new book, Secret Empires, for those interested in delving more into John Kerry's interests outside of the geopolitical security concerns of America. Sharyl, I wanted to move on and ask you about another topic area where there doesn't seem to be a lot of inquisitive minds in the D.C. press corps, and that's with respect to the Mueller investigation. It takes a federal district court judge to say, come on, man, when it comes to how Mueller is operating with unfettered power. At least that's a concern that Judge Ellis voiced. That's not a concern or even a question that's been asked of Mueller by anybody in the D.C. press corps that I've noted.
That's true. And I haven't, again, I don't have sources inside the Mueller investigation, so I've been hesitant to offer much criticism because I'd like to assume he's doing an aggressive and fair investigation. But I think when a court steps up who's looking at evidence and actually litigating some of this, and when the court says such things, I think it's good to have that sort of oversight because you're right, the same questions aren't being asked in general by a lot of the press. The leaks are fairly one-sided. A lot of false information is being leaked out, but when it comes out, whether true or false, it's typically against one side and not the other. So it is good to think that the courts may be, having a balancing and fairness effect as needed.
Do you think that there's been any chastening within the D.C. press corps about being advocates for a particular position, namely the demise of the Trump administration and Trump's presidency? Do you think there's been any reconsideration of their hysteria in the wake of his election and the approach they've taken to coverage of this Mueller investigation?
Well, no, because I think, as I've written about, the press corps has changed in tone and tenor and purpose over the years, whereby it's left the idea behind in many respects that it should be reflecting, ordinary Americans' opinions, both sides of issues, and getting at the truth. And it's been replaced by a lot of politically minded pundits and operatives and people who think that their goal is instead not to reach the truth, but to forward a certain narrative. So they're very happy that they're accomplishing their goal in some cases of forwarding certain narratives. But one thing that confuses them, I think, is to see, there was a poll I tweeted out from, I believe it was Reuters, that showed the president's numbers improving despite the height of the publicity against him in many different ways, including some information that's true and some information that's false. And yet, how can his popularity be increasing and the margin of Democrats' advantage coming up in the election being at its smallest point to date, according to this poll? Well, the pollsters actually put out a note saying, we think this is an outlier. It can't be true.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny because it mirrors what Associated Press and what Rasmussen also found. But they can't really seem to figure out why, if they're so successfully controlling the narrative. I would say maybe 85% negative on the president and 15% not on typical news if you look across the spectrum on TV. They can't understand how he could be increasing in popularity, just like they can't understand with nearly 100% of the media saying he couldn't be elected president. He got elected president anyway. So they still can't figure it out. I'll say we still can't figure it out because I'm in the media too. And I don't think they're any closer to understanding this phenomenon that the American people, what it is they really see, what it is they really want, and how they're starting to feel about the media.
This is the Pauline Kael phenomenon, right? The New Yorker film critic who famously said after the Nixon election in 1972, where he won 49 states, I can't believe Nixon won. I don't know anyone who voted for him. I mean, so it spoke more to her than it did, obviously, to what was going on in the country.
Well, so I've been out lately in Middle America doing shoots, and I always listen to the taxi drivers and the Verizon guy when he comes to my house in the summer. And lately, especially the past, I would say 3 months or so, whether they are, blue-collar, African-Americans, women, Democrats, I'm hearing a lot of positive chatter about the president. And that has not to be mistaken for my personal opinion when I express that. People say, oh, you're supporting Trump. I'm like, I'm reflecting what I'm hearing. And this was very much like what I heard before the 2016 election. Everywhere I went, people did like Trump, although nobody in the media liked Trump, or there was very little reflection of that in the popular media. I'm sensing that again.
President Trump, his newest hire, Rudy Giuliani, do you think he's helping the president or hurting him at this point?
I hate to not answer your questions, and I'm sorry. I'm just not qualified to say that and haven't really dug into that. I don't have, I'm not a political reporter. I don't really have an opinion on that. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag over the last 72 hours, but
he needs to stop with his media blitz.
Trump's happy, at least according to Rudy. Trump's happy. Let me ask you this. There was another story about Hillary Clinton last week that wasn't a story. I mean, here it was, but most of the D.C. outlets, again, that we're talking about, it wasn't. And I understand all the Mueller stuff, and there's competing interests to cover. But it was rather remarkable that she said, when asked the question of whether being a capitalist hurt her in the Democrat primary, she said, she wasn't sure, probably because 41% of Iowa caucus goers identify as socialists. There seems to be a story that has been unwritten about the changing ideological nature of the Democrat Party that Hillary Clinton sort of stumbled into with her answer. I think that's a big deal, and it was attendant to last week's kind of hagiographic reflections on Karl Marx's 200th birthday in the L.A. Times and the New York Times and elsewhere.
Well, I think, and even from a broader standpoint, as I've traveled to different places around the world in the past year, I hear this comment or complaint from foreign residents as well, that particularly their young people, this is according to some of the older people and politicians, have not learned properly about, in their mind, what socialism and communism really is and really does, and that the younger people today around the world, not just here, have come to sort of idolize or fantasize about this, great thing that could be, or that socialism or communism they believe is. And I don't know if it's what's being taught at the primary school level and on up. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but I do think it's a phenomenon, and not just here in this country.
She is Sharyl Attkisson, investigative journalist extraordinaire, author of the book The Smear: How Shady Political Operatives and Fake News Control What You See, What You Think, and How You Vote. Cheryl, thanks so much for joining us again. Appreciate your time.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you. I was 0 for 2. I didn't want to go 0 for 3 for questions not being answered.
Well, that's because you ask opinions of a journalist, and as a former journalist, you should know better, and you should be properly embarrassed, and you're going to be silenced for the rest of the show as punishment.
She joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.